All right. Well, let me introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. David Rudolph. We introduced David yesterday, but some of you have arrived since then. David is the director of Messianic Jewish Studies, professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at the King's University, Southlake, Texas. He earned his doctorate in New Testament from Cambridge and has published numerous books and articles on the New Testament, Second Temple Judaism, and Judeo-Christian relations, including A Jew to the Jews, Jewish Contours of Pauline Flexibility in 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23, which won the Franz Delitzsch Prize from a university in Germany whose name I cannot even pronounce, but he won the prize. And also co-edited Introduction to Messianic Judaism, its ecclesial context and biblical foundations. So let's welcome Dr. Rudolph for our next presentation.
I'd like to thank the Borough Park Symposium for inviting me to share this paper. One of the most exciting developments within Pauline studies over the past several decades has been the emergence of a new school of thought referred to as Paul within Judaism. This view maintains that Paul's life and teachings can be understood as fully within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. He did not burst its bounds, but plumbed its depths. Publications that have advocated for this way of interpreting Paul's letters have largely focused on Paul's view of Jewish law and Paul's mission to the Gentiles. The issue of Paul's mission to Jewish people and the priority that he gave it has been something of an elephant in the room. In this paper, I would like to focus on this elephant and raise the question, can Paul's statement in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, that the gospel is to the Jew first, be understood as an expression of Paul within Judaism? To put it another way, was it an affirmation of Israel's continuing election as God's people? Or was Paul's proselytizing impulse something alien to Judaism? In order to answer this question, we need to consider the context of Paul's statement that the gospel is to the Jew first. In this regard, we are going to look closely at Romans chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, before unpacking verse 16. Sounds good? All right. Let me just move these cables over here. There we go. All right, Romans chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, Paul's mission to the Gentiles. As a first step toward wading into these deep waters, I'd like to share a little story. There was once a financier who was vacationing in his yacht at the pier of a small coastal village. A native fisherman docked his small boat next to the man's yacht, and inside the boat were several large fish. The financier saw the fish and asked the fisherman how long it took to catch them. "Only a little while," the fisherman replied. The financier then asked why he didn't stay out longer to catch more fish. The fisherman replied, "I have enough to support my family for today." "What do you do the rest of the time?" asked the financier. I sleep late, play with my children, take a siesta, and stroll into the village each evening where I sip wine and play the guitar." The financier scoffed, "I am a Harvard MBA and can help you. You should spend more time fishing, and with the proceeds buy a bigger boat on which you can catch even more fish. Then you can buy several boats and eventually have a fleet. Instead of selling your catch to a middleman, you can sell directly to the processor, eventually opening your own cannery. You can control the product, processing, and distribution. Of course, you will need to leave this small coastal fishing village and move to the big city to run your expanding operation." "How long will all of this take?" asked the fisherman. To which the financier replied, "About 15 years. "Then what?" "Ha!" laughed the financier. "Then you will announce an IPO and sell stock in your company to the public. You will make millions. Then what?" asked the fisherman. "Well, then," said the financier, "you can retire, move to a small coastal fishing village where you can sleep late, fish a little, play with your kids, take a siesta, and stroll to the village in the evenings to sip wine and play the guitar." What is our goal in life? What are we aiming toward? And if we have a goal, is it informed by a sense of vision from God and for God? A friend of mine once said to me that a vision is a picture of your destination, somewhere or something that you are not, a mental image produced by the imagination, something that is or has been seen. It is future-oriented. Here is a working definition. A vision is a future-oriented mental picture of certain imagery put in the conscious awareness linked to dreams and desires that stirs up passion and motivates change and action. What is a really compelling vision? The most compelling visions are not self-centered. The real power of a vision includes other people. It is benevolent and turns into a service to others. In its clearest form, the vision can turn into a mission as it evolves, unquote. When it came to the Apostle Paul, he was a man with a big vision from God. His vision, according to Romans chapter 15, was to see the kingdom of God established on the earth in fulfillment of the words of the prophets, with Israel and the nations in unity and diversity, in interdependence and mutual blessing, worshiping the God of Israel and his divine Messiah, the Son of David. That was Paul's big vision. Paul also had a sense of mission from God. What is a mission? A mission is what you do to see the vision realized. Paul claimed to have received a mission from God. What was that mission? In Romans chapter 1, verse 1, he articulates this mission and says, "Paul, a servant of Yeshua the Messiah, called to be an apostle, a shaliach, set apart for the gospel of God." In Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 14, he explains to whom he is an apostle. He writes, "Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I glorify my ministry in order to make my own people jealous, and thus save some of them." Paul was a man, not just with a vision, but with a mission to the Gentiles, a mission that he received directly from the resurrected Yeshua, according to Luke. Paul writes in Galatians 2 about how he understood his primary mission as not being to his own people, the people of Israel, but to the Gentiles. He states, "The Jerusalem apostles saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. When they recognized the grace given to me, they agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews." To recap, Paul had a big vision to see the kingdom of God realized on the earth in fulfillment of the words of the prophets. We see this in Romans chapter 15. Toward that end, Paul sought to carry out his mission to the Gentiles. In Romans chapter 1, verse 13, he describes how his mission to the Gentiles led him to Rome. Paul writes, "I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles." What does Paul mean by Gentiles here? The word Gentiles comes from the Hebrew goyim, which means nations. The term often refers in the scriptures to all the nations except one, the nation of Israel. Paul's use of the Greek descriptor ethnicene, Gentiles, reminds us that Paul identified as a Jew. From Paul's perspective, the world is divided into two groups, Jews and non-Jews, or Gentiles. Gentiles who become followers of Yeshua remain Gentiles and do not become Jews. They do not become a third entity or a third race that is neither Jew nor Gentile, as some theologians suggest. Rather, in Paul's view, Gentiles who become followers of the Messiah of Israel become Gentile members of the people of God. In the context of Romans chapter 1, verse 13, Gentiles means non-Jews. And the fact that Paul can say that he hoped to come to Rome in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I've had among other Gentiles, suggests that he viewed the community he was writing to in Rome as having a Gentile majority. And this brings us to Romans chapter 1, verse 14, where Paul writes, "I am obligated both to Greeks and barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish." Paul viewed his mission among the Gentiles as a divine obligation. He had an obligation to the Gentiles because the Lord sent him to the Gentiles. In Romans chapter 1, verse 14, Paul, as the apostle to the Gentiles, shows that he can see the world through Gentile eyes. He highlights the diversity of the Gentile world and describes it as divided into two groups, Hellenes and Barbarois, Greeks and barbarians. Notably, the New International Version translates Barbarois as non-Greeks, but it is more clear to translate Barbarois as barbarians. What is the difference between Greeks and barbarians? For those of us who celebrate Hanukkah each year, we can understand the extent to which the Greeks looked down on other people groups. The Greeks viewed their language and culture as the height of civilization and regarded anyone who is not Greek as a barbarian. In fact, barbarois is an onomatopoeia for the making of unintelligible sounds. From the Greco-Roman perspective, those who spoke languages other than Greek and Latin were making unintelligible sounds. The Greeks viewed themselves as wise and the barbarians as foolish. Barbarians were thought to be wild, uncultured, and, I like this word, uncouth. As Robert Jewett puts it in his Hermeneia commentary on Romans, these character traits were seen as the polar opposites of Roman virtues. For the safety of the world and of civilization itself, barbarians had to be subjugated by Rome, which received this appointed task from the gods. In the context of Romans chapter 1, verses 13 through 14, Paul is talking about how, from the Greco-Roman perspective, the world was divided into these two groups, Greeks and barbarians. And Paul's mission as the Shaliach LaGoyim, the apostle to the Gentiles, was to serve both groups. To mention Hellesin and Barbarois, Greeks and barbarians, together was a standard first-century Greek way to refer to all ethnic groups and classes within the world. So when Paul says, I am obligated both to Greeks and barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish, he is saying that as the apostle to the Gentiles, he is called to bring the gospel to all Gentiles, regardless of their ethnic origin or social status. It is a powerful statement about the inclusivity of the gospel. And this brings us to Romans chapter 1, verse 15, where Paul writes, "That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome." Clearly, Paul was keen to preach the gospel. But why does he say to you who are at Rome? After all, the people he is writing to are already believers in Yeshua. Why does he want to preach the gospel to them? Perhaps he says this because the gospel is not just about hearing the good news of Yeshua and believing it. It is also about walking it out. In Romans chapter 1, verse 5 and chapter 16, verse 26, Paul talks about how his mission is to call the Gentiles to the obedience of faith. For Paul to say that he was eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome probably meant that he wanted to preach Messiah in Rome. He wanted to instruct them more deeply in what it meant to follow the Messiah of Israel, the Son of David, who laid down his life for the world. Having established this background concerning Paul's mission to the Gentiles, let us now turn to Romans chapter 1, verse 16, the focus of this lecture. And Paul's description of the gospel being first for the Jewish people. Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul's mission to the Jewish people and divine priorities. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul puts forward his understanding of divine priorities in relation to the Besorah, the good news of Yeshua. He writes in Romans chapter 1, verse 16a, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to," what's the next word? Everyone who believes. Leading up to this passage, Paul has already communicated 3 times that the gospel is for the Gentiles and that he is a servant to the Gentiles. We hear this loud and clear in verses 5, 13, and 14. And lest his readers have still not gotten the point, he says it a 4th time, now in verse 16. That the good news of Yeshua is for the salvation of everyone who believes, and that everyone includes the Gentiles. Paul has stressed this again and again because he wants the Gentiles to be secure in the knowledge that God loves them, that Paul loves them, and that nothing will change that. And it is at this point, after establishing God's commitment to care for the Gentiles, that Paul introduces the subject of divine priorities. He shifts gears to focus on the Jewish people, his own people, when he says in Romans chapter 1, verse 16b, that the gospel is to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Over the course of history, there have been at least 6 primary ways that scholars have dealt with the words to the Jew first and also to the Greek. They are as follows. Number 1, delete them. Get rid of them. Number 2, disregard them. Number 3, enigmatize them. Number 4, interpret them as chronological. Number 5, interpret them as strategic. And number 6, interpret them as covenantal. The first approach is to delete the word proton. First, in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. This is what Marcion, the 2nd century Christian heretic, did, and it was very effective. Out of sight, out of mind, problem solved. The gospel is not to the Jew first. The second approach is to disregard the words to the Jew first, to ignore them. For example, in F.F. Bruce's Tyndale New Testament commentary, he simply turns a blind eye to these words and addresses what comes before those words and what comes after them. A third approach to Romans chapter 1, verse 16 is to enigmatize the words to the Jew first, to relegate them to mystery. This is what Luke Timothy Johnson does when he writes in his literary and theological commentary on Romans. Quote, "The tension between universality and particularity lies at the heart of the problem Romans addresses, or better, at the heart of the mystery of God's will that Romans seeks to discern." Full stop, no further discussion. The words are simply inexplicable and puzzling. A fourth approach to Romans chapter 1:16, verse 16, is to interpret the words to the Jew first as chronological. The argument here is that Paul was referring to the fact that historically the good news of Messiah was shared first with the Jewish people and then with the Gentiles. The strength of this argument is that the gospel did indeed go first to the Jewish people. In Matthew's gospel, Yeshua told his disciples to minister only to fellow Jews and not to Gentiles. We are told in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 through 6, Yeshua sent out these 12, instructing them as follows. Do not go to Gentile regions. Literally, do not go on the road of the Gentiles. And do not enter any Samaritan town. Go instead to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. 5 chapters later, in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28, Yeshua models this Israel-centric mission. He meets a Gentile woman and only helps her after he explains to her that his mission, at least at this point in time, was to minister only to fellow Jews. Identifying himself as a shepherd of Israel, he says to the Gentile woman in Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. We have to wait 13 more chapters until after the Messiah's death and resurrection to hear Yeshua tell his disciples that the time has come to minister also to Gentiles. He says to his Jewish disciples in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Note that this is after 3.5 years of ministry focused solely on the Jewish people. Returning to Romans chapter 1, verse 16, where Paul says that the gospel is to the Jew first and also to the Greek, as I mentioned, according to the chronological interpretation, Paul was simply communicating in verse 16 that historically, in the past, Jews heard the gospel before Gentiles. There are two reasons why this explanation of Romans chapter 1, verse 16 is not fully satisfying. Number one, it does not explain why this was the case. Why was Yeshua sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel during his 3.5 years of ministry on earth? And second, all the verbs in Romans chapter 1, verse 16 are present tense. Paul is not saying the gospel was first for the Jew, then for the Gentile, but the gospel is first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. The apostle is saying something about the present reality. And this leads us to a fifth approach to Romans chapter 1, verse 16, that to the Jew first refers to Paul's outreach strategy intended to maximize the number of people that he could win to the gospel. The strategic interpretation argues that Paul followed this approach first for the Jew, then for the Gentile, because the people of the book, that is, our people, were most prepared to understand and receive the message. This interpretation has much to commend it. The Gospels cannot be understood apart from Israel's scriptures, and Israel's scriptures were primarily read in the first century by Israel. In his book, The King Jesus Gospel, Scott McKnight describes the gospel as the story of Jesus as it emerges out of the story of Israel. If this is correct, then it makes sense that Yeshua went first to those who knew the story of Israel and were awaiting the next chapter in this story, the coming of Israel's king, the ultimate son of David, the Moshiach. Moreover, the Gospels and Acts attest to a positive reception of this Jewish story by a minority within Israel. This included the 12 Jewish apostles, the 70, the 120, the crowds of Jewish people who followed Yeshua, the more than 500 Jewish people who witnessed his resurrection, the 3,000 Jewish people in Acts chapter 2 who welcomed the good news about Yeshua and were immersed, the 5,000 Jewish people in Acts chapter 4 who believed in him, not to mention the thousands of Torah-observant Messianic Jews in Jerusalem, described in Acts chapter 21. The initial positive reception of this Jewish story by Jewish people would also explain why about 25% of those named in connection with Paul's ministry were Jews. See writer Havolvik's essay, the title of the essay is Named Jewish Believers Connected with the Pauline Mission. In the book, Jewish Believers in Jesus, the Early Centuries, co-edited by Havolvik and Oscar Scarsani. The strategic explanation of Romans chapter 1:16, however, has its shortcomings. By the time that Paul wrote his letter to the Romans in the years 55 to 58 CE, Jewish people were not responding as enthusiastically to the good news of Yeshua as they had before. As Paul puts it in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 26, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Here Paul acknowledges that something has shifted in Jewish openness to the gospel, and Gentiles were now more receptive to the message than Jewish people. Moreover, he prophetically sees this as continuing until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. The narrative of the book of Acts brings out this transition in positive response from Jew to Gentile in dramatic detail. My point in reminding us of this history is that the strategic explanation of Romans chapter 1:16 leaves much to be desired if Paul, at the time he wrote Romans, regarded Gentiles as more open to the gospel than Jews. The strategic interpretation does not make sense of the partial hardening that Paul talks about in the mid-first century and that he expected would continue for some time to come. If Paul's use of proton first in verse 16 was all about being strategic, it would have made more sense for him to go first to the Gentile, since that is where he was seeing the greater harvest. Are you all with me? Okay. A second issue that makes the strategic interpretation less than fully satisfying is that in the wider context of Paul's letter to the Romans, there are indications that Paul has a more compelling reason in mind for why the gospel should go to the Jew first, a reason that makes sense within Judaism. And this brings us to the sixth approach to Romans chapter 1, verse 16, that proton points to Israel's election and covenant relationship with God. Notably, Paul uses the same expression, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, 3 times in his letter to the Romans. The first is in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, and the other 2 occurrences are in Romans chapter 2, verses 9 through 10, just a chapter later. There he writes, "There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek." Here, Paul's principle of to the Jew first clearly has nothing to do with the chronology or strategy of the gospel being preached. Rather, it seems related to Israel's election. The principle here is, to whom much is given, much is expected. And because Israel has been given much in the way of privilege due to their election and covenant relationship with God, the Jewish people will be judged by a different standard than the Gentile world. In the context of Romans chapter 2, it seems clear that the gospel goes first to the Jewish people because there is a covenantal priority. But is this a continuing priority? Some theologians, like Augustine, recognized that during the apostolic period, the Jewish people retained a degree of covenantal status. However, Augustine goes on to argue that there was a transitional period and that the Jewish people eventually lost their election. Hence, there is no longer a priority today to bring the good news of Yeshua to the Jewish people first. Augustine's way of thinking is dependent on a supersessionist narrative in which the church replaced the Jewish people as the people of God. But is this theology of Israel consistent with Paul's teachings? As the apostle puts it in Romans chapter 11, verse 1, I ask then, has God rejected his people? May it never be. Me genoita. In Romans chapter 9, Paul lists the various blessings that the Lord has given to the Jewish people. And then he writes in Romans chapter 9, verse 4, they are the people of Israel, chosen to be God's children. The Shekhinah is with them. The covenants are theirs. Notably, the words chosen to be God's children, the covenants are theirs, in Greek is in the present tense. There is no sense in Paul's thought that the Jewish people have lost their priority status as a covenant people, or that there is an expiration date on their election. Paul confirms this in Romans chapter 11, verses 28 through 29, where he writes, as far as election is concerned, They, the Jewish people, are loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Ametamaleita in Greek. While the word irrevocable in English translations usually appears at the end of the sentence, in the Greek text, ametamaleita appears at the beginning of verse 29, thus placing emphasis on this word, as though it were highlighted or had an exclamation mark attached to it. Paul's point is that Israel's general state of unbelief does not compromise its election, gifts, or calling. In other words, Romans chapter 1, verse 16, to the Jew first, needs to be read in the wider context of Paul's defense of Israel's covenant privileges throughout the letter. A defense that begins in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, continues in chapters 2 through 4, climaxes in chapters 9 through 11, and concludes in chapter 15. This covenantal interpretation of Romans chapter 1, verse 16, to the Jew first, is also confirmed by the examples of Yeshua and Peter elsewhere in the New Testament. The Gospels tell us that Yeshua went to his own people first because Israel had a covenantal relationship with God. Consider Yeshua's conversation with a Gentile woman who fell at his feet in the region of Tyre. She asked Yeshua to expel the demon out of her young daughter, to which Yeshua replied in Mark chapter 7, verse 27, first, proton, let the children eat all they want. The children Yeshua speaks of here are the children of the covenant, the Jewish people. Similarly, Peter declares to his fellow Jews in Acts chapter 3, verses 25 through 26, and you are heirs of the prophets and of the covenant God made with your fathers. He said to Abraham, through your offspring, all peoples on earth will be blessed. When God raised up his servant Yeshua, he sent him first, proton, to you. Here, Peter indicates that it is because of the covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people and the promises God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 that Yeshua ministered to the Jewish people first. In Luke's narrative, Acts chapter 3 points to Acts chapter 13, here, where we have an example of Paul walking out his to the Jew first principle with fellow Jews. Here Paul and Barnabas explain the principle to the Jewish leaders in Pisidian Antioch. We're told in Acts chapter 13, verses 44 through 46, on the next Sabbath, almost the whole city assembled together to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy, and they began to contradict what Paul was saying by reviling him. Both Paul and Barnabas replied courageously, it was necessary to speak the word of God to you first, proton. Since you reject it and do not consider yourselves worthy of eternal life, we are turning to the Gentiles. Note that when Paul says we are turning to the Gentiles, he means only in Pisidian Antioch, and not that he has abandoned his principle of going to the Jew first. We know this because Luke portrays Paul as going again to his fellow Jews first in Acts chapter 14, verse 1, chapter 17, verse 10, chapter 18, verses 4 through 6, and chapter 19, verses 8 and following. Returning to Acts chapter 13, like Peter in Acts chapter 3, Paul is motivated by covenantal priorities in bringing the gospel to his people first. He says in Acts chapter 13, verse 46a, it was necessary, anagkayan, to speak the word of God to you first, proton. The Greek word anagkayan is the same word that is used by the apostles and elders in Acts chapter 15, verse 28, 2 chapters later, to describe the 4 necessary things that the Jerusalem Council, through the leading of the Holy Spirit, placed on the Gentile believers. In other words, Paul viewed ministering to the Jew first as something necessary or essential, and not just utilitarian, as in the strategic view. The use of proton in Acts chapter 13 is informed by the covenantal context of proton in Acts chapter 3. Because of Israel's covenant relationship with God, the gospel goes first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Given Yeshua's use of proton in Mark chapter 7 to describe the Messiah's ministry to the Jewish people first, it is plausible that what we are seeing in Acts chapter 3 and Acts chapter 13 is in fact Peter and Paul imitating Yeshua's life and teachings in this regard. Even as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, after mentioning his work among Jews and Gentiles in that order, he says, "Be imitators of me as I am of the Messiah." Finally, it's important to raise the question of whether Paul's Pharisaic background informed his to the Jew first approach to outreach. Paul's focus on proselytizing Jewish people may not have been a radical break from Judaism as much as a reflection of the modus operandi of Second Temple Jewish missionary apologists who attempted to win fellow Jews to their own Jewish sect. Even as today, ultra-Orthodox Chabad Hasidim send out shlichim, emissaries or apostles, to proselytize fellow Jews to their brand of Judaism. Since Paul lived as a Pharisee and came from a family of Pharisees, it is possible that his approach to mission was in some way influenced by Pharisaism. In order to determine the plausibility of this, 2 questions need to be asked. Did the Pharisees proselytize? And if they did, whom did they proselytize? Is there any direct evidence that Pharisees engaged in active proselytizing activity? Notably, explicit evidence is provided in Matthew 23, verse 15, where Yeshua states, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert." Proseluton. Here, Matthew depicts the Pharisees as a group that engaged in proselytizing activities. Shai Cohen concedes that Matthew chapter 23, verse 15 is, quote, "an ancient source that explicitly ascribes a missionary policy to a Jewish group," unquote. Matthew 23, verse 15 does not indicate the extent of their proselytizing efforts. The text, however, implies that Pharisaic outreach was widespread enough that it caught Yeshua's attention, and he considered it worthy of comment. If proselytizing had been an insignificant aspect of the group's activities, there would have been no force to Yeshua's words. As for geographic extent, while no locations are given, the text seems to hint that the Pharisees were involved in proselytizing work outside of the land of Israel. You cross sea and land, it says. Whom did the Pharisees proselytize? The response to this question in contemporary scholarship often depends on whether the interpreter is a minimalist or maximalist on the issue of Jewish proselytizing activity in the Second Temple period. Maximalists typically interpret the passage as a reference to Pharisaic proselytism of Gentiles. By contrast, Martin Goodman, a minimalist, maintains that Matthew 23, verse 15, refers to Pharisaic proselytism of ordinary Jews. Goodman writes, "Is the conversion of Jews to Pharisaism something that Pharisees would have found desirable in the first century? The Pharisees believed that they alone could interpret the Torah correctly, and it would seem obvious that, like the prophets of old calling the people to repent, they should feel a duty to teach the rest of the Jews how to live righteously and bring divine blessings on the community. It is reasonable to suppose that they might wish as many Jews as possible to become Pharisees." Irina Levinskaya adds to the cogency of Goodman's argument by pointing out that Yeshua's woe in Matthew chapter 23, verse 15, is linked to the woe before it, which concerns Jews, not Gentiles. As Levinskaya puts it, quote, both woes are connected and develop the same idea with rhetorical intensification, unquote. The combined data corroborates Goodman's position in my view. It is unlikely that the Pharisees were critical of Yeshua eating with Jewish sinners when they were at the same time planning missions to Gentile sinners. The concern for one but not the other strikes me as unrealistic. More true to life and consistent with what is known of Pharisaic Judaism is Goodman's explanation that the Pharisees sought to win converts from among the masses of ordinary Jews. Why would Pharisees proselytize Jews and not Gentiles? Well, like Chabad Hasidim today, they were probably motivated by the election of the Jewish people and a prophetic burden to call fellow Jews to embrace God's plans and purposes for Israel. It is not difficult to imagine how Paul, a Pharisee of Pharisees, continued to carry this burden for his own people after becoming a follower of the Messiah of Israel. To sum up, Russ, I have argued in this paper that Paul's principle of bringing the gospel to the Jew first did not burst the bounds of Judaism, but was in fact a reflection of Paul within Judaism. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." The context leading up to the passage reiterates over and over that Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles and that his mission is to see a harvest among them. Paul maintains that the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone. In balance with this universal message, however, he states in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, that the gospel is to the Jew first. From the standpoint of the author of Acts, these are the words of a first-century Pharisee. We have examined 6 ways that scholars have approached Paul's words to the Jew first. One way forward is to delete the word first. Problem solved. A second approach is to disregard the words to the Jew first, to ignore them and gloss over them. A third approach is to enigmatize the words to the Jew first, to relegate them to mystery. A fourth tack is to interpret the words to the Jew first as chronological. It simply means that the gospel was shared first with the Jewish people and then with the Gentiles. A fifth way of understanding the text is that to the Jew first refers to Paul's strategy intended to maximize the number of people he could win to the gospel. And a sixth and final approach to Romans 1:16, but not the least, is that proton first points to Israel's election and covenant relationship with God. Notably, the last 2 explanations, strategic and covenantal, are not mutually exclusive. This said, in the context of Romans, Paul penned the words to the Jew first in chapter 1, verse 16, because he wanted the Gentile believers in Rome to know that God still had a covenant relationship with Israel. If we mirror read Romans chapters 9 through 11, it would seem that some of the Gentile believers in Rome were arguing that God had given up on his people, Israel. In Romans chapter 1:16, Paul fires the first shot in his argument to push back against this wrong teaching, a wrong teaching that is still prevalent in the church today. While it is a privilege for our people to be first, proton, when it comes to hearing the good news that the Messiah of Israel has come, our people have often wished that we were not a covenant people because of the responsibilities and challenges entailed. It is for this reason that Solomon Rabinovich, under the pen name Shalom Aleichem, who wrote the stories that Fiddler on the Roof are based on, has Tevye say to the God of Israel, "God, I know we are your chosen people, but couldn't you choose somebody else for a change?" Perhaps there were times when the Apostle Paul felt the same way. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's have some time for questions and answers. You all did a great job of lining up. Didn't that work well last time when we had a line at the mic? All right, here we go.
Gentile is here. And thank you so much for your insightful presentation. And with this opportunity also, I want to thank all the previous presentation, finding the Jewishness of Jesus in the past. But even though we just, we talk about Paul, but because of Jesus, we need to talk about, Paul. Then, I just want to ask two questions. You said Paul had vision, the big vision from God. So how do you know that was from God? That was my first question. My second one is, as time goes, we just talk about the Jesus, the past. He was here as a Jewish. And if we look up for the future, is he coming also as a Jew? That's my second question.
Those are really excellent questions. With the first question, it really has to do with, whether you believe that Paul's letters and the book of Acts are inspired by God and were given to us by God. They are part of the canon of the ecclesia, the church, the body of Messiah. So for those who are followers of Yeshua, we regard them as gifts from God, and so we treat them as sacred and as expressions of truth. With the second question, what I would say is that it's very significant that at the very end of the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, in the very last chapter of Revelation, that Yeshua is referred to, at the very end of time as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and as the root of Jesse, and so that text would seem to suggest that his Jewish identity doesn't get erased through the resurrection, but he continues to sit on the throne of God as a resurrected Jew, as the Jewish Messiah, and that when he returns, that he hasn't lost his particularity in that regard. So I would just encourage you to take a look at that text and see what you think.
Thank you, David, for an excellent paper. I'm curious if you see this phrase, that we've focused on as being rooted in any passages in particular in the Hebrew Bible other than the broad covenantal, context. That's sort of part one. And then secondly, and this may have been beyond the scope of the research for this paper, but do we see this phrase or anything analogous in other literature of the Second Temple period?
So those are excellent questions. I have not done the research on broader Second Temple Jewish literature, so I'm not sure. Within the Hebrew Scriptures, I think that we could find texts that refer to God's chosen people. All the texts that refer to the election of Israel, the unique chosenness of the Jewish people as God's servant, like in Isaiah. I think all of those texts could be brought to bear to be viewed as kind of like the substructure of Paul's, in a way, post-supersessionist theology in light of Romans chapter 9 through 11. Some thoughts to consider.
When you went through the 6 traditional ways of interpreting the phrase, it seemed like most of them are attempts to answer the question, why does Paul say this? With the answer, ultimate answer you're providing being a covenantal reason rather than a merely strategic reason or something else. But the question I have is not why does Paul say it? It's what does it mean? And I think in some of the things, your comments, you revealed, I think, some of what you thought it meant through illustrations that you used from the book of Acts. But what are the various possibilities for what the phrase itself means within that context? And
do you mean in a first century?
Yeah. What did Paul?
Context,
what is it?
yeah.
What does Paul mean when he's saying that? It's taken, for example, in our context, the gospel is for the Jews. Therefore, we need to be going first to the Jews. But is that what Paul means? What do you think Paul means in his context? Not why does he say it, but what is he saying?
Yeah. Well, as always, Mark, you raise great questions. So with that question, actually, I had a whole section attached to the paper, which I just didn't have time to bring here. But that section really focused more on the contemporary reality. How do we apply that today? I have not addressed that question that you've raised in depth, and all I can say is that's an essential next step, absolutely. But I do think that Luke's narrative is important because it does give us at least the beginnings of some textual basis for understanding what may have been, at least I'm arguing, may have been an outworking of that principle. And so in that context, when Paul is traveling throughout the Greco-Roman world and he comes into a new city, the first place that he goes is the synagogue. And I think that is very significant. Beyond that, the problem is we just have so little data. Yeah.
Thank you for the great presentation. Enjoyed it. I have 2 questions. Can I ask one after another, so not just 2 and then leave? Just I want you to remember what I asked. So my first question is related to what Mark asked, but a little bit differently phrased. For me, when I look at this passage, Romans 1:16, there is something special about the gospel that makes it like a thing, like something, because something what works, what is power by itself. I mean, it's not necessary. So it's more than just like some good news, and it's like, well, it's a different subject and topic to talk more about that. But would you agree if I would say that the gospel is by its very essence to the Jew first? Not just strategy, covenant, but another stone in this mosaic, namely, by its very essence, without to the Jew first, there is no gospel at all. Would you agree with that? And if not, why not?
When you say essence, what do you mean?
I mean that there is no gospel without to the Jew first. I mean the gospel that we see in the Bible. It's my perspective on that.
Well, I think I would agree with that, because at least at the very beginning of Romans, when Paul describes his gospel, he refers to the gospel as including the idea of the Son of David. The Son of David is integral to the gospel. And so, in that regard, the Jewish relationship to the gospel is intrinsic to the gospel. Otherwise, I don't think Paul would have defined the gospel in relation to Israel. So I would agree.
Thank you. Anyway, next question is related to the passage from 1 Thessalonians that I read yesterday. And I read it again, and I would like to hear your take on that. I mean, in relationship as Paul as the Jewish apostle or a Jew, and with his all the Jewish identity. So, Jews who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out, they are not pleasing to God, but hostile to all men, hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved, with the result that they always fill up the measure of their sins. But wrath has come upon them to the utmost. So how would you reconcile it with what you just said about the good Paul? So this is a Jewish dilemma. Thank you.
Well, I don't think it's either or. I don't think Paul has difficulty saying that his people, our people, had this blindness, that I referred to in Romans chapter 11, and that his people are imperfect, that his people are doing things that God is not. Some of his people are doing things that God is not pleased with, while at the same time saying that has not compromised the election of Israel. That has not compromised God's covenant relationship with the Jewish people. So I think that's where the tension lies, that it's kind of both and not either or. That's the best I can do.
It is interesting that Paul says, I'm not ashamed, which is not the same as saying I am proud. So it seems, so let's explore two things, I guess. Paul is responding to an assumption or an accusation that the gospel is somehow shameful. And it's probably because it's a gospel about a crucified Messiah, a crucified Jew. And I think, what do you think of this thrust? Not as a translation, but as a kind of a characterization of Paul's message. He's saying, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God for salvation to the Jew, of course, and even to the Gentiles. How does that fit, do you think, with Paul's mentality?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think as a Jew, that was his mentality. Those were his people. We see that in Romans chapter 9 at the beginning, his yearning for his people, his identification with his people. So absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Rudo, for the wonderful presentation. My question is, we see Yeshua and the Apostle Paul and the apostles following the same pattern that God used when he wanted to redeem the world. He went to the Jew first, or to the first Jew, Abraham. And we see the prophets of Israel writing about the same pattern. Israel being saved and the nations being redeemed as well. But we also see in passages in like Galatians 3:13 and 14, where Paul writes that Mashiach redeemed us from the curses mentioned in the Torah, so that the blessings of Abraham could reach the Gentiles, so that we, the Jewish people, might receive the promised Spirit. So it might look like a contradiction, like God is going to the Jew first to redeem the world, but there is also another pattern saying that when the blessings of Abraham reach the nations, Israel will be redeemed, like Paul uses similar statements in Romans 11, the fullness of the Gentiles bringing salvation to Israel. What are your comments on these two apparently standards?
Yeah. So that's where I love Kendall Solin's language of interdependence and mutual blessing. You know, this concept that the way God has worked it out, and you know, Paul describes it in Romans chapter 11, this absolute dependence one on the other, and that we can't do everything by ourselves. We are completely dependent on the other, and that it goes both ways. Yeah, so it's interesting. I work at the King's University, and many of you know that it's connected to Gateway Church. And Pastor Robert Morris, the senior pastor there, has this expression, blessed to be a blessing. And I think it is a wonderful expression, but I do think that if we can understand the to the Jew first principle that Paul lays out in Romans chapter 1, verse 16 in that way, that our people are blessed to be a blessing to the Gentiles so they can be a blessing back to Israel, and that the cycle just kind of continues, then it eliminates this kind of concern that I think Paul was initially addressing in those verses leading up to verse 16, that God just cares about the Jewish people. He doesn't care about the nations. Or, you know, God cares about the nations, but now he's not so concerned about our people. So, blessed to be a blessing, I think, says it well. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was thinking about the first question, and I was wondering if you would just take a moment to talk about Acts chapter 9 in terms of vision and mission, and the question was, how did we know? Could you discuss literally the word vision and Paul had that right from the start? Like, this wasn't an afterthought. I mean, that clearly it was a vision from God. And even with Ananias going, don't you know that guy's reputation? Could you kind of comment on vision and mission just in the Romans 9 passage?
Okay, so when Paul is called by the Lord and the Lord through Ananias, when the Lord speaks to Ananias and then Paul receives this vision, one of the images that he's given by the Lord is this: you are being sent to the Gentiles. You are being sent as a light to the Gentiles. What's interesting is later on, though, in Acts, it's not just the Gentiles. It includes his own people, and I found that very significant. So yes, Paul was the shaliach, the apostle to the Gentiles. He was given that mission at that moment of transformation. But it is significant, I think, that in Luke's narrative, that that his own people are not somehow sidelined by that mission.
Follow-up question on one born out of season. He seems to reference himself as apart from the other apostles in relationship to this. Is that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I can add to that. I haven't thought that through. Yeah.
Hi, David. I'm wondering, you brought up the idea of light to the Gentiles, and in both Isaiah passages, it connects kind of a bring back Judah and be a covenant to the people. So is there any Second Temple literature that would use that as a basis to the mission of the Jewish people to go to their people first and then to the Gentiles as a backdrop to what Paul is talking about in Romans?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in Philo, you see some of that. There's definitely, there is this universal impulse within Second Temple Judaism. I think that it's very important that when we talk about Paul's sense of universal mission, that we connect it to the prophets of Israel. That it's not just he had this vision for the world, but he was carrying the burden that the prophets had for the world. And one reason why I think that that is very important for our community is that sometimes the wider Jewish community challenges us and says, you know, the only reason why you want Jewish people to believe in Jesus is because you want Jesus to return. And so Jewish people are just this pawn, essentially. And you're trying to manipulate things in order to have this final goal realized. And I think it's important that we push back on that and say, no, that is not how we view it. We are carrying the burden of the vision of the prophets for the restoration of the world. We're looking to see tikkun olam. This is the prophetic image that we have in the Tanakh. And we see following the Messiah of Israel as part of that larger plan, the mission that we've been given leading to that prophetic vision. And so I think we can challenge the wider Jewish community and say, do you have a vision? Do you have a universal vision? And is that rooted in the prophets? And if the answer is yes, we share that in common with the wider Jewish community. So then if the wider Jewish community is doing humanitarian work and other things toward that prophetic vision, is that manipulative? Is that using people as pawns? And the answer would be no, of course not. So I think it's very important, just to kind of reiterate, that we see Paul as carrying that prophetic vision. And I think for our community, we should carry that as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your paper and contextualizing Paul in early Judaism. I just want to make sure I understand your point and the main argument. So, you know, you list out, you have the chronological view and the strategic view, and you pointed out the inherent weakness is that there's no real rationale provided as to why you would go to them first, why you go to the Jews first. And then point number 6, like, you make such a great argument and fill in that blank. This is the rationale because of covenant faithfulness. And yet on the grounds, like when you're pointing out in Acts 3 and Acts 7 and so forth, that it's still kind of a literal going to the Jew first. It's just that you've provided the rationale why. You've answered that question. So just how you understand Romans 1:16, is it that you are supposed to go chronologically or strategically to the Jew first, but you're providing the rationale, which is the covenant faithfulness?
Yeah. No, that's right. I'm saying that the covenant faithfulness motive it's almost, I used to actually have an aversion to that passage because I felt that Paul was kind of objectifying our people in some ways. And I felt as a Jewish person a little uncomfortable with the idea of like us being prioritized in some way. I did not like it. It really kind of bothered me. But over time, the more that I've looked at it and the more that I've come to think of it, it was almost like Paul's slogan. He does use it several times in Romans, so slogan might not be an appropriate term, but it's almost like Paul's slogan for post-supersessionism, like for his pushing back and saying no to that whole replacement theology in a very, very short, just a few words. He can say, no, God is still giving Israel its covenantal priority. And so now I actually feel good about it because I think that slogan has within it this nucleus of that whole post-supersessionist way of thinking. But it took me a long time to kind of arrive at a place of comfortability with it. Yeah.
David, well done. I agree on every point, and I agree with your conclusion concerning covenantal faithfulness, or priority. Is it possible that there may be a seventh to consider? That sounds very Jewish. And that is maybe a wider strategic understanding that's not just limited to the Jewish community individually, but what Paul unpacks in Romans 11:11 through 15, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So that it's not only the covenantal commitment, but Paul's understanding that the salvation of Israel, the blindness coming off of the eyes of the Jewish people, ultimately will unlock the blessings of God to the world, life from the dead. Talk about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This was really just an attempt to try to begin to lay things out and organize them so that others can build on it and begin to develop other approaches and other explanations and kind of fill out. Again, I only had 45 minutes, but it went over. So I totally agree, Jonathan, with what you're saying, that there is so much more here that we need to unpack. And I think for the Messianic Jewish community, this is an extremely important passage.
Yeah, I'd like to affirm what you're saying and also make a plea for a seventh option, which Mark Nanos refers to in his commentary on the mystery of Romans, where he talks about what I think some of us in our movement have, which is that we've had to go into a defensive mode because of 2,000 years of Christian supersessionism. But we are in danger of seeing Romans 1:16 as not challenging what Nanos calls our own misguided exclusivity. So Nanos says, for Paul, the pattern of salvation history has been and always will be, even in the midst of confronting misguided exclusivity on the part of some of the children of Jacob, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So we're in danger because of the history of our context, do you think, of not seeing this as a warning against us as Messianic Jews being exclusive in the way we apply the passage?
Yeah, that's why I felt it was so important to build out verses 13 through 15. Because it's the combination of all of that you arrive at this balance, the particular and the universal. But I would just add, too, in light of what you're saying, Richard, that this verse is a very important verse to our pushing back against dual covenant theology, which would say, oh, well, God has a separate track for our people. They don't really need Yeshua. Our people have the Torah, and Yeshua is really just for the Gentile world. I think that, again, this passage, in just a few words, communicates that is simply not the case from Paul's perspective.
All right, we're doing great. We have time for one more for sure, and if you go really fast, we probably could get a final question after that, but we're good.
So how fast should I go? All right. So thank you for the paper. I really appreciated it. I was wondering if you could speak more about how this principle, this concept of to the Jew first, is rooted in Yeshua's teachings. You mentioned Matthew 10, you mentioned Matthew 15, but I was wondering if you could talk more about Matthew 10 in particular, because there it seems like we have a similar pattern, where in the beginning of the chapter he's sending his disciples out, and he says, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, avoid the way of the Gentiles. And then in 10 verse 16, it's like it shifts a little bit. The verb tenses change. He begins to use the future more. And he even says that you'll be a testimony among the Gentiles. And then it sort of wraps up in verse 23 with, you'll be persecuted, but you will not finish going through all the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. So I was wondering if you could, speak more to that in particular.
Yeah, I would only just add that I think in Matthew's gospel, from the very beginning, Matthew has this universal vision. So we see Gentiles listed in the genealogy, but then, at the very beginning, Yeshua is the son of Abraham, son of David, the son of Abraham. It's the particularity is there as well from the beginning. So it seems to me that in Matthew's gospel, that the two strands of the universal and the particular are just woven in throughout. So yes, you do have in chapter 10, this focus on going only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but the universal is just never lost in the gospel.
All right, here we go. Final question, a model of concision.
Well, you mentioned that Paul wanted to preach the gospel to those in Rome who were already followers of Yeshua, and also that the gospel spoke in particular of the Son of David, both of which fall outside of the scope of a traditional Christian explanation of what the gospel is. So I was wondering if you might speak briefly on what is this message that Paul wants to go first to the Jew and then to the Gentile?
So actually, it's a great question to finish on, because I think that in our community, the Messianic Jewish community, we need to be able to answer that question, what is the gospel? If we don't know what it is, how are we supposed to share it with our people and beyond our people? So I have found Scott McKnight's book, The King Jesus Gospel, to be very helpful in that regard. Again, he attempts, what's very interesting there is here you have an evangelical theologian, New Testament scholar, and he's acknowledging that the evangelical world cannot define the gospel. So it's not just our community that's struggled to arrive at clarity on that issue, but in his attempt, although I think he does have a kind of supersessionist perspective, I think what's helpful is he does see, in his definition, the gospel as essentially the story of Yeshua as it flows out of the story of Israel. The story of Yeshua as it flows out of the story of Israel. And so, in that regard, if you think of the gospel in that sense as the story of Yeshua as it flows out of the story of Israel, the Son of David is key to that story, because Yeshua is the Son of David, and he's continuing, he's the next chapter in that story, of that story coming to a culmination. And so I would say that we need to unpack it in that direction. We need to see the gospel as a story. At the same time, to your point, the gospel is not just a message that is spoken verbally. The gospel is a message that we live out. And so it's through our bearing witness to Yeshua, through our deeds, and through our words that we speak, on a daily basis, not just the message words, but, the words we speak to each other. That is the ultimate testimony, in my opinion, of the gospel. And so, with respect to our people, it's not just about handing out tracts, it's about bearing witness of the life that Yeshua has filled us with, and the transformation that he's effected in us, and the wider Jewish people, the wider Jewish community being drawn to that light within us. If all we have is the message but not the bearing witness of our lives, something is deeply, falling short. But I think we have both, And so, Baruch Hashem.
Thank you. Amen. So, how many of you here in the room were present for the first Borough Park Symposium? So a good number. If I remember correctly, I think that was the topic of the first symposium, is what is the gospel? And part of the controversy was, do we even need to define it? It's so obvious what it is. But we discovered that it was not so obvious, and we did need to define it. Which leads to my brief announcement before we have a blessing and break for lunch, because Messianic Publishers has a table with books which includes the Borough Park Symposium selection. Is that correct? So you can address that question, what is the gospel, in the first Borough Park Symposium book. All of the books are available for 50% off here at the conference. The only limitation is that's just one copy of each at that 50% off price. And you get a free calendar. You know how they say on TV, wait, there's more.